Hello and welcome to the webinar, Racial Trauma in an Uncertain World, Maximizing College Students' Strengths and Taking Care. Thank you all so much for joining us here today, and special thanks to our presenters, Dr. Marcia Liu and Dr. David Rivera. My name is Elizabeth Roby. I'm an editor at Coherent Digital. We are an academic publishing company and very happy to host this webinar. As people continue to join the call, I have some quick housekeeping details I'd like to share before we get started. So if we could have the first slide, please. Thank you so much. Great. So first, we will be recording this webinar and we'll email you with a link of the recording in a few days. Closed captioning is available. Please click on the CC box below your screen to activate the closed captioning. We also encourage you all to use the chat box. We'll keep an eye on it and monitor it throughout the hour. There'll be time for questions at the end. Please provide your feedback in the chat box. We appreciate that. And before I introduce Dr. Liu and Dr. Rivera, I would like to take just 1 minute to talk about Mindscape Commons, which is our new online database of video content designed for counselor and social work education, teaching, and training. I know we have a lot of faculty on the call. If you're interested in reviewing the content, we'll send a link out in our follow-up email along with a recording of the webinar. So 2 quick slides before we introduce our speakers. Mindscape is an online immersive and interactive video database for faculty to use in their teaching and training. It comes with hundreds of mental skill training videos to use in the classroom, great for counseling skills, ethics, multicultural theories courses. They're brief videos, easy to embed and assign. Many of them are interactive, coming with assessment questions, and we provide a lot of faculty support materials such as instructor guides and book chapters. Next slide, please. Our content has been developed in community with faculty and graduate students helping to both create and advise in the content development process, with a focus on inclusion and highlighting historically underrepresented voices. So you can see some of the topics here within our video content. And as I mentioned, we'll include information on how to access Mindscape Commons in our follow-up email along with the recording. Thank you so much for that last slide. I now have the pleasure of introducing our wonderful speakers today. Dr. Marcia Liu was born in New York before moving to Maryland. She received her BA in economics and psychology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, her MA in psychology from New York University, and her doctorate in counseling psychology from Boston College. She completed her pre-doctoral internship at the Brooklyn VA Hospital and her postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia University's Counseling and Psychological Services. Dr. Liu currently serves as the mental health coordinator for the Hunter College AANAPISI project, working to increase awareness and understanding of the needs of Hunter's diverse Asian American Pacific Islander student body. At Hunter, she also teaches in the Asian American Studies program, leads mental health programming for faculty and staff, and also facilitates a faculty seminar series focused on culturally informed pedagogy. Outside of Hunter, Dr. Liu is a national advisor to the STEVE Fund, that's spelled S-T-E-V-E, STEVE Fund, which focuses on wellness and mental health needs of young people of color. She is a licensed counseling psychologist, and she has a private psychotherapy practice in Brooklyn, where she works mostly with women, BIPOC, queer people, and/or trauma survivors. Her research and clinical interests focus on mental health policy, immigrant experiences, racial identity development and race-related stress, sibling relationships, trauma, and intergenerational conflict. Dr. David Rivera is an associate professor of counselor education at Queens College, City University of New York, CUNY, and founding director of CUNY's LGBTQI+ student leadership program. Dr. Rivera received his doctorate in counseling psychology from Teachers College, Columbia University. He also holds degrees in psychology and counseling from Johns Hopkins and the University of Wyoming. A counseling psychologist by training, his professional experiences include college counseling and higher education administration. His practical work includes consultations on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Rivera has worked at a variety of institutions, including the University of Pennsylvania, Georgetown, Prince George's Community College, the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, and the Addiction Institute of New York. His research focuses on cultural competency development and issues impacting the marginalization and well-being of people of color, as well as oppressed sexual orientation and gender identity groups, with a focus on microaggressions. Dr. Rivera has published journal articles and book chapters in various areas of multicultural psychology and social justice, and his co-edited book, Microaggression Theory, Influence and Implications, was released in 2019. He just recently shared with me he has a few co-edited books coming out in a couple of months, including Affirming LGBTQ+ Students in Higher Education, as well as Critical Theories for School-Based Practice, a Foundation for Equity and Inclusion in School Psychology and Counseling. Dr. Rivera is an advisor to the Steve Fund, just like I mentioned with Dr. Liu, on faculty with the Council for Opportunity in Education, and he holds leadership roles in the American Psychological Association. Thank you both so much for being here and offering your time and talents toward this webinar.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for inviting us to join you and to share some of the work that we've been doing, especially over the past couple of years in the multiple pandemics that we find ourselves navigating concurrently. And just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we hope to share with you today, as we hope to focus on some consciousness raising, focusing on how race impacts our lives, going over racial trauma and the impact on student wellness, and then some tools that we can use to help students prepare for the traumas that they will experience. And so there's a racism recovery plan that Dr. Liu and I will go over together. So consciousness raising. So I think it's two of us to kind of spend a little bit of time discussing what consciousness raising means and how it is actually a useful, not even a useful, an essential critical tool for marginalized people in terms of having the resources and the knowledge to address the oppressions that we navigate on a regular basis. And so we'll go over some critical issues, including the various spheres of oppression and racism. And then we'll talk about some of the issues that impact students and some of the internalized oppressions, especially that create some of the issues that we're hoping will provide some skills to address. We want to kind of position our talk within an ecological framework. This is not new by any means. Ecological frameworks have been used in a variety of settings and disciplines. In psychology, Urie Bronfenbrenner was one of the first to kind of bring an ecological perspective to us in terms of how people develop, how we develop in terms of the transactional relationship between us and the environments that we navigate. And so we think it's important to position ourselves this way for several reasons. One, for all too long, the individual has been kind of the target or the owner of the kind of psychological issues and traumas that we possess, or that we are given actually. And we want to kind of flip the script on that. We kind of want to position institutions and the public policy as really those systems and contexts that produce the oppressions that people then kind of absorb, right? And so it's really that we need to be fixing institutions and systems as opposed to trying to fix people. And additionally, something that hasn't been included so frequently in an ecological model is the historical context, right? All too often we talk about issues ahistorically, right? We talk about racism all too often as if it's something that's a chance occurrence, when we know via critical race theory and the research that has been done for decades that racism is a normed part of our society, right? And so taking into consideration the historical context helps us to kind of understand these issues in a more complex ways. And it also helps to raise our own consciousness about our own unique histories in this country and beyond, and the strengths that we can take from those histories and also the learnings that we can carry with us forward. So just a brief introduction with the campus ecology framework.
Thanks, David. I think when we think about where the ecology that each of us is kind of occupying space within, all of us are always interacting with various institutions that, like David said, there is a history to those institutions, and there is policy and legislation and decision-making that happens that impact the lives of folks of color, and specifically students of color, in historically detrimental ways. We're talking about structural racism. We're really thinking about the institutions, the policies, and the practices that perpetuate these barriers to opportunity and prolong, just continue racial disparities on this societal level. I think a lot of times when we think about institutional racism or structural racism, we think about health disparities or gaps in academic achievement. And I think when we're focusing on higher ed experiences, we also have to think about reliance on like standardized testing as, like, quote, being objective measurements of intelligence, or funding that goes towards certain departments that are seen as serious and elite and historically, rich, versus other departments that might be seen as being kind of frivolous or like kind of navel gazing. It could be about giving space towards students, that's offering campus space towards certain groups and not others. It could be about a lack of mentorship that's available for students of color, these resources just don't exist in the same way that they might for white students in particular. Okay, so what does this kind of look like? Oh, we're a little too, yeah. Thanks, Dr. Rivera. So one like very great example and manifestation of this is noticing just the representation on campus of faculty, knowing that white faculty are overrepresented on campus, as well as Asian faculty in particular departments, whereas Black, Indigenous, and Latinx faculty are very much underrepresented. And the impact of that, knowing that there will be more students on campus that are of color versus the faculty being of color, what that does over a 2 to 4 year period, however long the students might be there, in never seeing, people that they feel like have gone before them that can connect to their racial experience. I think these are the ways that structural racism continues to perpetuate, and nobody has to say anything. These decisions have already been made long before, and it might even feel like unconscious. We just made these decisions to hire these people. We didn't think that we were doing this purposefully, and yet the impact is insidious and consistent and harmful.
Reminds me of I did a panel with President Shirley Collado of Ithaca College, and she said, if you can't see it, you can't be it.
Oh, wow.
And so it kind of makes me think about it. If students aren't able to see images of themselves, right, cultural representations of themselves,
for sure,
people that sound like they do on campus, or especially in terms of the disciplines that they're studying, that's going to have an impact on how they position themselves within those disciplines and how welcome they feel going into that discipline. For example, if someone is an accounting major and they've never had an accounting professor that looks like them, or that affirms their identity, that might send both overt and covert messages about their positions in that field.
And I feel like there's a sense of, speaking about this from an Asian American perspective, of like, there are a lot of stereotypes associated with being a model minority. So I might not be so surprised seeing a Asian American identified chemistry professor, but an Asian American French lit professor would blow my mind, like to be like, oh, all of us can expand in all of these spaces. We all contain multitudes. There's nothing wrong also with majoring in chemistry and being a chemistry professor. But I think there also is just sort of this like it kind of grows our own sense of ourselves when we see people existing in ways that we haven't even imagined for ourselves yet.
Definitely. So part of what we're also doing here is we're talking about the relationship between the various spheres of systemic oppression. That's why we started with structural racism, and now we're going into microaggressions, which have kind of been some of the most commonly spoken about forms of oppression in recent years, especially as the microaggression research has kind of literally exploded to cover many topics and many contexts. And additionally, you can turn on a sitcom nowadays and there is a whole episode that'll be themed about microaggressions in a very correct way. So people are actually getting it correct. However, we can't think about microaggressions being the sole culprit of oppression, right? how I like to consider microaggressions, which hopefully you all are familiar with what they are by now, but just to give the very general definition, these are brief and commonplace interactions. They can be verbally communicated, behaviorally communicated, or they can be embedded in the environments that we navigate, but they communicate hostility, derogation, insults towards anybody who holds a marginalized identity. So people of color, women, queer folks, poor people, people with disabilities, first-generation college students. And so these events can be intentional or unintentional. Oftentimes people focus on the intent of it. And microaggression theory teaches us that the intent doesn't matter, right? The impact is what we should be focusing in on, right? Just because someone doesn't intend to hit somebody with their car doesn't mean that the person still isn't going to suffer some kind of physical injury, or at least injury to their car, right? And so the insult has already been communicated and the result has already been felt, right? And so the microaggressions are often go under the unawareness of, or under the awareness of people as well, which is why we need to be talking about them and catching them when they happen. We kind of consider microaggressions to be the glue that keeps structural oppression alive. Right. And so as long as the structures are inherently racist, sexist, heterosexist, ableist, classist, et cetera, microaggressions are going to continue to persist.
Mm-hmm.
So what might they look like? You know, they come in a variety of forms. If you happen to be a Black woman and you have an opinion, regardless of the strength of that opinion, you're often targeted as somebody who's angry. Right. And so that goes along with some of the myths about Black women in this country and their positionality and their temperaments, et cetera. The one image of a young person holding up a sign saying, "No, where are you really from?" Right. It's not bad to ask people where they're from, especially in this very multicultural world that we live in. However, when you don't believe the first answer because you're assuming based off of how someone looks that they're not from the United States, and so the follow-up question is, "No, where are you really from?" Right? The implicit message is like, you don't look like you belong here, right? And so it's a message of othering, and it's not creating a space of belonging for, especially AAPI folks and Latinx folks. The middle one is a common experience for students of color, where they're often asked to be the voice of their entire racial group. We know that's just impossible. We know there's so much within group difference, and nobody can be the voice of their entire group. So the limited representation in my class does not make me the voice of all Black people, is a sign that he's holding up. So either you're going to be racially spotlighted, which is the experience that he's speaking about, which even though you're being asked to share your experience, you're not being asked to share your own experience. You're only being seen and appreciated for the race that we're seeing you as, not as the individual and the unique talents that you possess. The converse of that is you're racially ignored, right? Which also renders the person invisible in that situation. The last one I like to joke about as being my favorite. This one happens to me quite frequently. When I was giving a speech on racism, the MC introduced me as Jaime Garcia. My name is Jaime Rodriguez. Not all Latinos have the last name Garcia. I've been given both of those last names and additional ones. It's become so frequent that even in my friend group, it's become a joke, but that's a means of coping with it, and one that I'm complicit with. But when we don't take the time to learn people's names, we're also telling them that we don't think that they're just important to begin with. Our names are extremely valuable to us, right? They give us a lot of identity, and they hold a lot of meaning. And so I keep on hearing about professors, especially, and I'm a professor, so I can call out my own profession, giving their students nicknames without their permission just because they can't pronounce the name, or they're not taking the time to learn how to pronounce the name, right? Our mouths and our language in general, as long as we're, able-bodied or what have you with our speech, can produce a range of utterances. And so we have the ability to do that. So let's take the time and honor our students as much as they should by learning their names, if that's the only thing that we do. That's going to send a sign of validation.
Absolutely. I think it's so great that we're thinking about okay, structure, this is where we're sort of all baking within. And then there are these interactions that are happening that a lot of times faculty perpetuate, that students perpetuate amongst each other, that college staff perpetuate. Then there's also what is being carried within the student themselves. And David, I wanted to focus on this just so that people could have an appreciation for the weight that each student is entering a classroom with, that nobody actually has to be overtly racist to them for them to already be thinking and considering, how am I showing up in this room and what are people perceiving me as? And that's going to, that stress is going to impact their performance in the class, as well as just their well-being. So not just about their success in their grades, but just how they're doing as a person. So we wanted to focus on how internalized oppression works. Experiencing racism stress doesn't require any other person to be in the same room outside of us. We can be that person for ourselves. White supremacy is very creative in how it works. It has created a lot of efforts to ensure that we can sometimes buy into these beliefs if we're not careful. So we might find ourselves as folks of color believing or endorsing any kind of negative stereotypes associated with being our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, our ability status, our social class, suddenly noticing that we're performing to try and avoid being seen as those stereotypes, or just being afraid that other people are going to see that way. So trying to cut ourselves off from that part of ourselves, kind of kill that part of ourselves that it associates with being a woman, with being queer, with being trans, with being Black, with being having any kind of ability status, that is being disabled. Like, these are all different ways that maybe we try to take space from sometimes, just so that we can avoid experiencing what we think we can avoid experiencing racism in our present. So this can get really exhausting over time. The next slide shows about one particular type of internalized oppression, which is stereotype threat. I'm sure a lot of you have already been very well versed in what this is. I always like to go back to the initial experiment. I remember learning this when I was in my master's degree, and it just blew my mind. I'd never thought about how stereotype had impacted me for the last 25 years. The initial experiment was done where there was a control group and experimental group. There are Black and white folks in both the control and the experimental group. And the only thing that they did in this experiment was to give both groups a verbal SAT test. There was one difference. In the experimental group, they got the test and they had to identify what race they were at the top of the page. The groups did significantly different from each other. When Black folks had to identify that they were a Black person taking this test, just part of a study, they did significantly worse on the test than when they didn't have to identify what their race was. Wildly, the white folks in the experimental group actually did better when they had to identify their race than when they didn't have to identify it. What does this tell us? That just even thinking that my performance on what this task is about to represent the group that I belong to, that is going to mess with us in various ways. That's going to show up as the sense of either distractedness, anxiety, poor performance on tasks. People traditionally don't do well on tasks that when there is a stereotype about them, that they're going to perform poorly, it can become this self-fulfilling prophecy. A lot of times this also leads to folks just completely wholesale avoiding different areas, different fields, different tasks, different explorations, different activities, anything that they think, oh God, I'm going to make a fool of myself. And I'm just going to confirm the stereotype. That's what the threat is. Mm-hmm. So I'm just not even going to try. It's so powerful. Nobody has to say this. I think a lot of times this can come up for sure for Black and Latinx folks in terms of being assumed to be intellectually inferior, for Asian American folks that they're going to be assumed to speak with an accent or not know English well and not be outgoing. So there's just this, I'm just going to stay away from public speaking, or they're just going to think that I don't speak well. There's a lot of choosing to avoid these things. And this then perpetuates these racial and gender gaps in the field, that like people aren't avoiding them or avoiding the fields. There's different representation. And then we never also grow those skills in those spaces where maybe we're super competent, but we're too scared because of how insidious racism is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Marcia. Yeah, internalized oppression. I've been finding that the more that I talk about it, especially to younger people, the more that I see light bulbs and aha moments go on, because it's a language that has not made it to the mainstream yet, but needs to be in the mainstream. Sure. As Marcia mentioned in the description of internalized oppression, it doesn't require anybody else to be there to trigger it for us. These messages and these oppressions have been normed inside of our minds and our bodies since birth for so long that we have a hard time teasing apart what is my own unique talent, knowledge, experience, etc. And what are the things that have been planted in my brain from the oppressor that now I'm taking ownership of, but I really shouldn't be, because they're only leading me to have, compromised wellness issues, or they're cutting off opportunities or what have you. And one of those is imposter phenomenon. It used to be called imposter syndrome, but we need to depathologize everything, including the terms that we use. Imposter syndrome kind of indicates that maybe it's a disease or an illness, which can be construed as such, but that just pathologizes the person. Really, what imposter phenomenon is, it's the voice of the oppressor, or the voice of whatever is normed in society. So everyone, regardless of identity, has some kind of imposterism going for them, right? Where we might be checking ourselves, we might be criticizing ourselves too much, etc. However, if you also are a marginalized person, now you're also going to have the voice of the oppressor operating as well as part of that imposter phenomenon, which can be telling you messages like, oh, you're not worthy of being here, right? Oh, nobody really cares about what you have to offer because you're not really that smart anyway. I had these thoughts go to my mind. I have a PhD, for crying out loud, and I still kind of question, not even kind of, I do question my intellect on a regular basis. But because I have the language of imposter phenomenon and I have tools to address it, I kind of just shut it up and say, that's not my voice. Even though it sounds like me, I'm like, that's the voice of the oppressor that has been normed in me. And so I kind of have mantras like that I use to directly attack this imposter voice and try to quiet it down as much as possible. And these are some of the things that we can do with people around us, ourselves, or with our students, is just by teaching people about these concepts, just by teaching them about these concepts. And we have many teachers on this call, so I know that you know how to teach, right? Or at least I hope you know how to teach. We can share this information about internalized oppression, stereotype threat, imposter phenomenon. And just by having that knowledge, that can be healing in and of itself for that student.
Right, because these are external things. Realizing that this isn't my own voice, this is something that I can actually be in control of and remove, is like so relieving for so many people. I was just thinking about, David, how much courage it takes to say that this isn't my own voice. I actually can fearlessly know that I am quite capable of this. And, I'm going to struggle in my life. I'm not going to do everything perfectly, and I'm going to strive for different things. But that voice that I'm actually a fraud, that I've snuck into this, that I'm actually not competent at all, it takes courage to be on the other side, but how liberating it can be if you can get there.
Definitely liberating, right? This is definitely necessary steps on that journey to liberation that many of us are focusing our careers on helping to create and foster, all right, various communities.
That's right.
Yeah, so everything we've been talking about are all kind of manifestations of racial traumas, right? That can have an incredible impact on well-being and beyond.
That's right. So Miriam Jernigan hashtagged racial trauma is real. I think one of the reasons why this needed to be said was that for so long we thought about, just like we thought about microaggressions as seemingly non-consequential, it's about people being hypersensitive. It's about people, it has really no impact. When we're actually finding out from all the data, there's so much empirical data that backs up that microaggressions themselves cumulatively and individually have a physical and emotional impact on people. So never mind with racial trauma, then we're also talking about even broader experiences, like having somebody yell something to you in the street that is racist, having a professor also ask you to be the racial voice for your group. These are all racial trauma experiences, as broad and as direct, also as kind of abstract or fuzzy, or I kind of think that this happened, but I'm not actually able to label it. Is it okay to say that what happened was racist? All of this counts as racial trauma. And all of it has an actual impact on our bodies. What's wild about it is that, first I'll go through some PTSD symptoms that can result, all of them can result from racial trauma. But one thing I wanted to note previously is that it doesn't take a racial trauma event happening to you for you to experience the PTSD symptoms afterwards. All that has to happen is for you to know that it happened to somebody who looks like you. So if you witness a video or a news story, if you read a news story and see a video of a Black man being assaulted by a police officer or killed by a police officer, that's going to stay with you. And you're going to experience that as if it's happened to you, because it could happen to you in some way. And so when you learn about a hate crime that's occurred to an elderly Asian American person, this is going to stay with you. You are now also experiencing the same types of PTSD symptoms as we've traditionally thought of as associated with sexual assault, with getting a car accident, with being in a war, these very specific experiences that we haven't yet actually appreciated in the same way about racial trauma. So here are just a couple of these symptoms, avoiding thinking about, not wanting to think about what happened. That could be my teacher microaggressed me in front of my entire class. I'm the only person in there who realized what was happening. I don't know what to do. I don't want to think about it. I just don't want to think about it. Or I'm kind of irritated and I'm pissed. And that's going to come out in my interactions with whoever I have access to today. Or I can't stop thinking about ways that I should have gotten back at them. I should have said this thing, or maybe I should have said this. I can't stop thinking. It's intrusive how I'm thinking about this. Being able to sleep, feeling like avoiding wanting to go to the place that the thing happened. I mean, these are all typical symptoms of PTSD. And this is absolutely this applicable to any of the racial traumas that we've talked about so far.
And Marcia, even just you describing that, I felt the emotion in your voice just by recounting again some of the, I'm sure you even had images possibly flashing your mind as you were recounting some of these aggressions that you just vicariously observed possibly in the media or what have you that still have a detrimental impact on your well-being.
Absolutely. And this is cumulative too. The more we each have, I used to call this like a racial trauma CV. We've all been through different racial traumas. And as it adds up, of course, it stays in our body and we're still processing them even years later.
Definitely. Additionally, what they can look like on campus, we often talk about student engagement, right? And even measure it on some campuses as part of how we assess our campus cultural climate for students. How engaged are they, especially students of color? And we know that there are disparities in educational attainment, access, and outcomes for students of color, often starting with disengaging from the educational environment. Now, when you think about it, if the educational environment is oppressive, if the student is experiencing both microaggressions, which are those behaviors I spoke about earlier, and the macroaggressions, which are the policies and procedures and the environmental manifestations that you don't need somebody to trigger, but that kind of attack whole groups of people concurrently, why would you want to be a part of that environment? So my own experience told me that, I didn't go to class a lot my first year of college because I didn't see many representations of folks that look like me, right? And so I didn't feel included. And that's what caused me to disengage a bit my first year, right? And so I know many people disengage, not because they're not academically inclined or they don't have the motivation to be there above and beyond the oppressions that they experience, but the oppression is so strong that can create the barrier in and of itself that precludes somebody from even accessing an institution of higher education. This also has an impact on our academic self-concept, another concept that's studied in the ed psych literature in terms of what we need to have as going for us in terms of how we understand our relationship with academics. Do I feel like I can actually accomplish these tasks at hand? Do I feel like I have the agency and the self-efficacy beliefs to withstand 4+ years of undergrad and get that degree, right? And that all is predicated on having a positive academic self-concept. But again, if a student is day in, day out experiencing microaggressions in an academic setting, that's going to have an impact on how they understand their academic prowess or abilities. A weakened social support network. And again, myself as an example, when I not withdrew from college, but when I withdrew from the environment into my dorm room my first year as an undergrad, I didn't have many social support folks around me, right? We need to be in community so that we can access social support, which is one of the main and primary sources of coping that we use as people because we're very interpersonal beings by nature, right? We're interconnected. So that's also going to fail. Self-doubt, right? The continuous barrage of these oppressions are going to cause us to question ourselves. That's kind of the imposter phenomenon speaking there. And these are just tiring. I just did a workshop last week and a student was talking about just how tired they were from having to just wake up and think about going to class, or wake up and think about going to work where they're going to experience oppressions, or just walking around their community. And they were saying, I just find myself so fatigued. And they didn't have the language. I'm like, well, what you're describing is racial battle fatigue. I'm like, this is a real concept. And that was relieving for the student. It didn't take away the oppressions that they were dealing with, but at least they had a concept in a language to make sense of their experience. And they also knew that others are also experiencing this as well. Because all too often we keep them to ourselves, and we can feel so lonely when we don't share with other people. But definitely these things are going to be causing the fatigue. Our cognitive resources are limited, right? And so not only are we now using our cognitive resources to do the things that we need to do day in, day out to survive as people, but now I'm having to navigate the systems of oppression, which are probably even more taxing than someone's job or what have you, right? And so that's going to be an additional source of weight that somebody's going to carry. Survivor's guilt, especially for, let's say, first-gen students of color who are going away to college, maybe leaving their families of origin, maybe trying to uplift themselves economically and socially or what have you, can have that sense of survivor's guilt, which is something that we need to process, especially with first-gen college students. And then dignitary harm. This is a concept that you're probably not going to find anything written about. I had the opportunity of hearing Kimberly Crenshaw, the critical race theorist and legal scholar, speak a few years ago. And she mentioned this concept of dignitary harm, which occurs when a person feels as if they can't bring their entire self to any given setting. So if we think about school, if I'm experiencing a barrage of racial microaggressions, I may try to do a lot of code switching so that I'm not kind of acknowledging my racial my racial identity and my cultural identity, right? And so I might start even speaking differently, using different words, maybe curating the experiences that I share, right? And that causes harm to our dignity because we're not able to show up as full beings with our full intellect, our full selves as much as possible. We're not being appreciated, right? And so that kind of creates a disintegrated sense of self. And that has an impact on our sense of self-worth, which is really what dignity is. And so this is also something that we need to be talking to our students about and assessing. What is their self-worth like, right? If our self-worth is not tight and intact, that's going to have an impact on nearly everything that we do, right? And so now I'm kind of conceptualizing dignitary harm as being one of the first harms that happens to somebody who is experiencing oppressions from racism and other forms of oppression. So how do we recover, Dr. Liu?
So there are a bunch of different ways, but there have been some wonderful, fortunately at this point, there have been some really great resources that have been put together. These are a couple that are adapted from a wonderful article that was headed by Dr. Brianna French. These, I think I think for me, especially with racial trauma, we kind of take it for granted that we'll just cope by how we'll just do whatever, when you're depressed or anxious. I'm sure the same coping mechanisms work then, do the self-care stuff, take time for yourself, breathe, know that you're okay. We actually need to have more prescribed or specifically articulated skills and mechanisms for recovering from this particular trauma. So one way this can happen through a variety of ways, but I think I just want to emphasize how much that this is a particular type of trauma that requires its own set of skills and tools. First, about acknowledging, being able to recognize what racial stressors are in your environment, and being able to understand the racial dynamics of any of your relationships, whether that's with your in-laws, your friends, your cousins, your students, your faculty, your advisors, knowing how that positionality and how those dynamics are constantly interacting with each other, this is helpful. And then being able to recognize, I know what happened there. They said this thing and it was microaggressive. I don't think they meant it that way, but this is why it's upsetting. And this is what I'm going through. So being able to acknowledge and recognize what's going on in the environment. Second thing is this piece that we keep emphasizing about consciousness raising, steeping yourself in a knowledge of this historical timeline and a contemporary timeline of how racial dynamics are interacting in this moment will also always help you have the tools and resources to recognize this is not because of a failure on my part. I'm trying my best every day. It's more about what's going on in the context that I'm in, and how can I recognize that so that I can be aware of what's getting manifested in my context. Generally, absolutely going towards building a practice around mindfulness and self-care. I mean, we don't want to scrap it. Of course, it's absolutely necessary for us generally to return to our physical bodies. And more specifically, how can I be mindful of how I'm responding to this event? What's going on with me physically? Do I feel like my heart's racing? Do I feel like I'm bracing for something? Am I not sleeping? Why is that? Maybe there's something that I'm not articulating that's about happening inside me and in response to the environment. Seeking support. So I always say, know who to go to, know who to not go to when you're going through an experience of racial trauma. There are certain people that will be trusted, that you know that won't ask you to give you a litany of proof, you know, that what you've been through is real. People who will validate what's happened as being awful and upsetting and legitimate. People who generally will help you also build pride and comfort and support and connection, who really empathize, even if they identify differently, that they can support and affirm that your identities are absolutely important and that they want to support you in the growth of those identities. Connecting to your cultural roots, that could be however you identify. Many of us, all of us are bicultural in various ways, never mind multicultural. Finding homes that feel like cultural homes for you, where you can feel rooted and grounded and known and understood, is absolutely one other way that you can always return to that home when you're going through this experience. And finally, for a lot of people, myself included, sometimes this means getting out of the house, putting on your sneakers and being active in some way, specifically about organizing, feeling like you're part of a community that's working towards justice, whether this is for your community, whether it's for a community that you're an ally to, that feels like you're with like-minded people that are fighting for something, fighting for liberation in some way. Sometimes physically, this is what it takes, that you can journal a lot and you can breathe and do the meditations, but also you need to be with people and working towards something. Because I think a lot of times we're so steeped in helplessness and hopelessness with racial trauma that what we need to do is to find ways to recover by being active. And it's unfair, it's unjust that this is what we're saddled with. And also these are the ways that we maintain connection to ourselves, we maintain connection to our joy, and it's revolutionary, you know, maintain connection to each other. Mm-hmm. So there is also a more prescriptive kind of plan that myself and some colleagues of mine up at Boston College had put together. And David and I are going to present a little bit about this particular plan. This is called the Racism Recovery Plan. And our idea is that after a racist event occurs, BIPOC often struggle to cope and really orient themselves to what's happened and never mind know how to recover. One thing we can do in moments of peace, moments of no active engaging trauma that's happening in our life, is to reflect on this and to prepare, because as David said earlier, these experiences, this trauma will happen to your students. It is happening, it will happen in the next day, in the next week, in the next month. These are experiences that are just frothing all the time in our communities. So having a recovery plan in advance can help to establish some kind of racial identity stability. It is a practice, just like mindfulness. You have to kind of return to this and think of this as like an upkeep, something you need to exercise so that you can cope, and also you can have a healthy racial identity, whether there's trauma or not. So Dave and I are going to go through what this plan will look like and talk a little bit about how we cope. So the first part of this plan is about reflecting on how do you respond when a racist event occurs. This could be something that you're reading about in the news vicariously. This could be something that you're surviving yourself in directly. It could be a microaggression. It could be a racial epithet. So for me, I know, like, healthily, I think is the code word, the big word here. How do you respond healthily? I think for me, a lot of times it's about acknowledging the validity of what happened. Yes, that did happen. It is real. Talking about it and helping, like, reaching out to other people to share about it, and reflecting on, okay, what did I learn about that situation? What did I learn about that relationship? Or maybe, about my lack of safety, in that particular context. I don't know. David, how about for you? What is a way that when you're coping healthily in the wake of a racist event, how does it usually look like?
Yeah, I think I'll also share how I cope unhealthily.
I would love that.
I think this concept of I think people might be a bit perplexed about the concept of reacting or responding to racism in a healthy way, but it's so
Yeah.
true. You just described, right? There are certain, like so often, like there's a particular person I have to work with, and I know that I'm going to absorb oppressions either directly or vicariously whenever
Yeah.
I meet with this person. And there have been times when I've been very reactive and I've been argumentative, right? And there have been times when I've also walked away just perseverating over
Yeah.
the issue,
Yeah.
right? Both of those were unhealthy for me. And then there are times, and Marcia, you know this, where I've used my handy phone and I've texted you or others who are in my kind of my support group, kind of my
Right.
racism support group, if you will, who
Right.
once I text, oh, this person did this again, I get the feedback from Marcia is like, oh, yes, obviously, this is what you can expect. And I'm sorry to hear this. But validation, right? I need to be validated in my experience because all too often we're invalidated in our experiences of oppression when we communicate them to others.
Yeah. And I think it's such a good point, David, that like, we should never, there's no shame about reacting however you're going to react. Maybe we should even like the idea of healthy versus unhealthy. If you're responding in a way that's potentially destructive to you, you're responding in the best way that you can in that moment. And we could critique it if we wanted to, but I also want to just validate that we're all trying the best that we can. There are, of course, ways that might lead to less harm to yourself. And this is really what we want to ideally aim for, but it's such a human thing, you know, to respond however we're going to respond. One thing that I think also can be helpful, and this is sort of the step 2 of this, is about this daily upkeep. How do you stay centered? What strategies help you cope generally with keeping a really affirmed, positively oriented racial identity? So for me, this can be about reading about work that AAPI activists have done, reading work by AAPI scholars, reading work by other BIPOC scholars and BIPOC activists, watching art that's created by our communities, generally reflecting and talking about my experiences as an Asian American Pacific Islander person with people who identify as being API, as well as importantly, people who don't, so that I feel like I'm seen and understood in all my spaces of my life. Obviously, that can be limited depending on who I have access to, but at least that's the goal. You know, that's what I'm trying to do. It doesn't have to be that I'm thinking about it all the time, but it's something that I want to check in on. Like, how am I thinking about this every now and then? David, I wonder what this looks like for you.
I think one thing I've been doing more recently is I've been curating my media, and that's part of my daily upkeep because we're constantly engaged with media. And all too often, I think especially over the past 2 years almost, that we probably engage with it too much, probably without much of a filter in terms of kind of thinking about, well, what is the overall impact of this on me? And so we know that we live in a society where people of color and our images are often not validated or found. And so but they're out there in the media, in movies, in film, in podcasts, on Instagram, from various influencers and what have you. And so what I do personally is I curate my media so that I have just positive messages coming to me, or validating messages coming to me on a regular basis. And that's something that I take stock in on a regular basis and that I consider as part of my daily upkeep.
That's I feel like it's such an underrated, it's such a underrated has such an underrated level of power in how we're thinking about ourselves and our consciousness, you know, what our media is and how it's filtering messages to ourselves about our validity in the world. That's such a great thing to check in on. I wonder about also like identifying stressful situations, what racial events are upsetting for you. For me, this can be like identifying, knowing that I'm going to feel alienated in certain social situations, being microaggressed, especially if there is an in front of other people thing. I think it's personally devastating, but it's also, there's a shame component to when it's also with other people that I think about too. I know we're a little bit short on time, David, so I'm going to go a little bit faster through these last two. But I wonder also whether there are specific warning signs that you experience where you can anticipate, oh, this has been an upsetting experience, and I think I need some support.
Oftentimes we feel it in our bodies before we have the language to articulate what's going on.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I think these last three are really about creating response plans. This is like in emergency, break glass. What do you do? Something has happened that is very upsetting. who are you going to call? Who are you going to talk to? Who are you not going to talk to? For me, a lot of times this is get in touch with these close people, including David, about like, this is happening. Maybe take some time away from these people who won't really understand or might question me. Maybe reduce my sources of media that I'm consuming to only ensure that they're affirming. Maybe it's about calling a therapist, calling a spiritual advisor, relying on somebody that I look up to. This is about humanizing my experience so that I don't have to feel like I'm experiencing it on my own and that somehow it's not legitimate. These different levels of having acute response plan, having crisis planning, these are like at first, like you're reaching a certain level of of severity, and then even worse, what would you do? And I think it's important to identify what's different about those two. Some people, it's like, you know what, I can do okay. I can journal about it, talk to some people, that's it. Other people are like, I'm gonna have to have a kind of a system shutdown for me to recover from this. And that needs to be okay. And I need to anticipate that. The last thing is to have the post-crisis recovery. Just know who you can do, or who you can be in touch with after you've kind of recovered, to be like, hey, I went through something and I want you to know what that was like.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Marcia. So again, just to kind of emphasize the point, we can expect racism to happen, right? So just as we can expect possibly a car accident to happen when we get into our cars, we put our seatbelt on, right, as a preventative measure. This is what we're offering as kind of a preventative measure and as an active process that people of color can engage in, knowing that we're going to encounter racism day to day, day in, day out, right? And so we should be prepared for it. We shouldn't act as if it's something that is a chance occurrence. And the more that we prepare for it, the more that we're going to get through these issues with hopefully less traumas kind of being internalized in us and being able to kind of form a shield, if you will. So some things that we can do as well is making sure that our coping strategies are on point and that you assess your coping strategies on a regular basis, knowing that they have a shelf life often and they're not always going to be available. So those of us that went to a gym frequently before the pandemic hit, gyms were done, right? For the most part, we had to pivot quickly to think about how am I going to address my physical well-being and health, developing fixed and balanced time, incorporating well-being checks. You are the best expert in your wellness, and teach that to your students. They should be journaling about their wellness on a regular basis so that they can understand when patterns emerge, when they may need to seek additional support and help. Mindfulness, we can have a whole session on mindfulness. I've heavily leaned into it. Go to mindfulness for teens. Don't get caught off for the for teens part. I use these meditations for myself and with many adults, but there's some recorded meditations on there, especially for those that are new to it, that I find are kind of good gateway meditations to mindfulness, if you will. And then just always emphasizing your strengths. So Marcia and I are blessed to be counseling psychologists, a subdiscipline in psychology that focuses on strengths and optimal well-being. And that's what we know that takes us through and carries us through the oppressions that we experience on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I think I can't advance the slides for some reason.
No, that's okay. Our next slide was on critiquing your mental health resources. Oh yeah, great. A lot of folks will have access to mental health resources through their college, depending on how much funding has been given towards that department. I just wanted to encourage people to be critical about those services. You don't have to take whatever is available and to settle with a practitioner who might not be bringing up issues of race and oppression and class and sexual orientation and gender and identity in other ways. It's really important that you know that it's okay to center those things and to explicitly say, these are things that I want to talk about. Do you have history working with folks like me? Do you feel like I was wondering how you think about it. These are questions that providers, also practitioners, need to be trained to know how to answer and to be able to foster trust, in the therapeutic space. We're really hoping that, these services become more and more inclusive and embracing and affirming, regardless of the person that you're sitting across and what identity and positionalities they occupy. But this is something that we want to really encourage folks to just don't wait for the therapist to bring it up. You can be the one to say, this is what I want to talk about. I'm going to focus on this. What will that be like with you?
Mm-hmm. I just want to kind of reflect on some of the comments in the chat. So someone is asking about, the context of education. So we're talking about the context of education as a specific kind of a system that we navigate, but we know we navigate multiple systems, and the systems of oppression these systems, so higher ed, the criminal justice system, healthcare, employment, et cetera, they're all interconnected. And so they kind of manifest very similarly, right? And so the kinds of microaggressions someone is likely to experience in a higher ed institution are very similar to the types you're going to experience in the workplace, right? And so we can kind of transfer a lot of this knowledge to various workplaces and various demographics of people.
Yeah.
We also had if I can, this was just sent to the panelists and not to the whole group, but if I think if in our follow-up recommending perhaps some resources on how counseling trainees can understand and navigate code switching in counseling settings.
That's such a good question. I'm thinking about how, I mean, certainly having, I can't think of a particular code switching resource. When I think about code switching, I'm thinking about it as a manifestation of needing to kind of perform whiteness in different spaces, needing to perform higher class, needing to perform a privileged identity. And so part of my question around that is like, I wonder about the counseling dynamic. Is it that you're noticing your patient, your client, maybe try to perform in a particular way? What does that mean? That's something that you could totally explore with them about maybe their preconceived notions about how they have to present to you as a therapist. Or is it about how they're code switching in other spaces in their life and they feel like they can be their most authentic self with you? Then it's a question of like building the skills, the tools, and the self-esteem, the confidence to recognize like, okay, what am I afraid of will happen here if I show a more authentic self? What will I lose? What do I risk? And that can be a personal decision about, how they're kind of coping with that in that particular setting. That decision about like, maybe I need to code switch, otherwise I'm going to be treated in incredibly racist ways. Okay, that's another conversation around how do you survive? And then how do you recover from having to use those tools? Because I think like there are ways that code switching is absolutely exhausting. And then also, I think we need to also be realistic about the way that white supremacy occupies space. There's not often availability a lot of times in these really, really toxic spaces for people to be their most authentic selves. And we have to have space for processing that.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, comments, anything you'd like to send into the chat box for the next minute or so? We're coming up to the hour, and so appreciate this wonderful presentation. Yeah, just a lot of appreciation. Thank you so much for that nice comment.
I know we flew through a lot, not a lot of time. So
I think Dr. Liu shared the resource for the racism recovery plan in the chat. So there's a link.
Yeah, I can put that in again. I really encourage folks to look at it. I mean, I wrote this out. Dr. Rivera has seen it, my like written out version of just who do I reply? And it's a good meditative task to think about.
And in our follow-up, Dr. Liu and Dr. Rivera, in our follow-up email, we'll be sending a recording. And then if I'll just check in with you on some of these links, if we could include those in the email as well. We'll do that for everybody who attended and who couldn't attend but did register.
Definitely.
I don't see the racial recovery plan here. There should be 2 manuscripts that are available there. If you download the infographic, Racial Trauma is Real, or the manuscript, both of those, the link that I sent, you should see the download manuscript by agreeing. It's in there. The racial recovery plan is in that manuscript. And it's also in the infographic to the right.
And again, in our follow-up, we'll go ahead. We'll just make sure everything in our follow-up email is sent as well.
Ariel, there it is. I was sending it just to the panelists, not that helpful. Sorry about that.
Great. Well, okay, yeah, it looks like people are getting it. Great, terrific. Well, we're right at the top of the hour, and I just want to thank Dr. Liu, Dr. Marcia Liu, Dr. David Rivera for your wonderful and insightful presentation. And thanks to all of you who attended. As I said, we'll send out a recording link within a few days, along with some other follow-up information. Thank you.
For having us. Yeah.
Thanks for having us, Elizabeth.
Okay. Everybody have a good rest of their day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.